The Women's National Basketball Association has never seen anything like this before. Records are falling at a pace that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Arenas that once struggled to fill half their seats are now sold out weeks in advance. Television ratings have surged by hundreds of %. Corporate sponsors that once ignored the league are suddenly lining up for partnerships. A $2 billion media deal has transformed the financial landscape of women's sports almost overnight. And at the center of this explosion stands one name that has become impossible to ignore: Caitlin Clark. When Clark arrived in the league, the entire ecosystem of women's basketball shifted. What used to feel like a niche competition suddenly became one of the hottest stories in American sports. Her debut season didn't just produce highlight plays and sold-out crowds. It rewrote the economic script of the league. Viewership numbers shattered records. The draft drew millions of viewers, and the ripple effects extended far beyond her own team. Even arenas where Clark wasn't playing started seeing attendance spikes. Merchandise flew off shelves faster than retailers could restock it. Jerseys bearing her name appeared in cities that had never previously paid attention to Indiana basketball. Within months, she broke long-standing rookie scoring records, earned all-star recognition, and secured one of the largest endorsement deals in women's basketball history. The league moved quickly to capitalize on the momentum. A massive new broadcast agreement brought major partners like Amazon, NBC, ESPN, and ION into the fold. The value of that deal dwarfed anything the WNBA had ever signed before. Expansion franchises began entering serious discussions. Charter flights, something players had fought for years to obtain, finally became a reality. Sponsors started returning calls they once ignored. Primetime television slots replaced late-night broadcasts. Every indicator pointed to the same conclusion: women's basketball was no longer struggling to survive. It had entered a genuine growth era. But while the public saw celebration, something very different was unfolding behind closed doors. Inside the Women's National Basketball Players Association, tensions were quietly building. In a move that surprised many observers, the union voted to opt out of its collective bargaining agreement years earlier than expected. Technically, the move was routine labor strategy. When revenues rise, players seek to renegotiate their share. That's how professional sports negotiations normally work. Yet the timing and the tone that followed began raising eyebrows across the league. The opt-out triggered a deadline. If a new agreement could not be reached before the next season, the players would have the legal right to strike. No games, no season, no television broadcasts, and perhaps most significantly, no Caitlin Clark drawing record-breaking audiences every night. Suddenly, the league's biggest moment of growth came with a potential risk few fans had anticipated. Publicly, the union's demands seemed reasonable. Players wanted higher salary caps, larger rosters, stronger maternity protections, and better mental health resources. Given the league's new financial deals, many observers believed those requests were achievable. League executives had even signaled openness to discussing them. But as negotiations progressed, another layer of the conversation began surfacing, one that had little to do with salaries or travel conditions. Some of the union's most vocal figures started speaking about something broader: the identity of the league itself. Who gets promoted? Who gets marketed? And whose story the WNBA should center moving forward. The discussion began shifting away from economics and toward culture. And that shift introduced a level of tension that simple contract negotiations could not easily resolve. One veteran voice, Natasha Cloud, publicly argued that even significant salary increases might not meaningfully change players' financial realities due to taxes and the high cost of living in certain cities. Her point about expenses wasn't entirely inaccurate, but the way it was framed triggered a wave of backlash. To many fans, especially those paying for tickets, jerseys, and streaming subscriptions, complaints about six-figure salaries sounded disconnected from everyday economic reality. Former WNBA star and analyst Rebecca Lobo cautioned that messaging like this could undermine the league's credibility at a moment when it was finally gaining widespread support. For decades, the WNBA fought uphill battles for media attention, sponsorships, and investment. Now that the spotlight had finally arrived, public disputes risked feeding critics who had long questioned the league's sustainability. Meanwhile, team owners were watching closely. Many had already committed millions toward arena upgrades, franchise expansions, and new infrastructure based on the expectation that the league's growth would continue. The possibility of a strike introduced a frightening scenario, a historic surge in popularity suddenly halted by internal conflict. But the most complicated fracture wasn't between owners and players. It was inside the locker rooms themselves. Professional sports unions rely on unity. Superstars and rookies, veterans and newcomers, all must stand together for collective bargaining power to work. Without that unity, the leverage disappears. Yet as negotiations intensified, whispers began spreading that not every player viewed the situation the same way. Some believed pushing aggressively for structural change was necessary while the league had leverage. Others feared that escalating tensions during the sport's biggest moment could damage the fragile momentum the WNBA had spent decades trying to build. And in the center of that storm stood Caitlin Clark. Ironically, Clark herself had said very little publicly about the negotiations. Yet her presence loomed over every discussion. She represented the league's new audience, its new financial power, and its new media attention. To supporters, she symbolized growth and opportunity. To skeptics, she represented a shift in spotlight that raised uncomfortable questions about how the league chooses its stars. What began as a routine labor negotiation had quietly transformed into something far more complicated, a debate about the future identity of women's basketball. The financial boom created by Clark's arrival had opened doors that had been closed for decades. But it had also exposed fault lines that the league had never fully confronted. The WNBA now finds itself at a crossroads. On one side lies the momentum of record-breaking popularity, historic media deals, and a new generation of fans discovering the sport. On the other side lies a deeply complex internal conversation about fairness, recognition, and control over the league's narrative. Whether those forces collide or ultimately find balance may determine the next chapter of women's basketball. Because the truth is, moments like this rarely come twice. Leagues spend decades waiting for a cultural breakthrough like the one the WNBA is experiencing now. And what happens next could decide whether this golden era becomes a lasting revolution or a fragile moment that slipped away just as quickly as it arrived. For decades, every major professional sport has learned the same painful lesson. The moment a players' union begins to fracture publicly, the balance of power at the negotiating table changes instantly. It has happened in baseball, in football, and in basketball. Owners do not need to outsmart a divided union. They simply wait. When players begin arguing with each other in public, when leadership loses control of the narrative, the leverage that once belonged to the athletes slowly slips away. A fractured union eventually collapses under the weight of its own internal conflicts, and management walks away with the upper hand. That is exactly the situation beginning to unfold inside the Women's National Basketball Players Association. On the surface, the debate surrounding a potential labor dispute in the Women's National Basketball Association looks like a standard negotiation about salaries and revenue sharing. But anyone paying close attention can see that something deeper is happening. The disagreement inside the union is not simply about strategy. It runs along far more fundamental lines: financial security, career stage, and the cultural identity of the league itself. What began as a routine contract negotiation is increasingly looking like a structural divide within the players' own ranks. On one side of that divide stand many of the league's most established veterans. These are players who have spent years building their reputations, collecting championships, and forming connections across the international basketball market. For them, the WNBA salary is only part of their financial reality. During the off-season, many of these veterans travel overseas to play in European leagues across Turkey, Spain, France, and other countries where women's basketball has long been more financially lucrative. In those leagues, a top-tier player can earn hundreds of thousands of dollars in a single season, sometimes between $300,000 and $500,000 depending on contracts and endorsements. That additional income provides a cushion that younger players simply do not have. If a WNBA season were delayed or even canceled because of a labor dispute, these veterans would feel the disruption, but it would not necessarily threaten their financial stability. The situation looks very different for another large segment of the league: the mid-tier players, younger veterans, and rookies who are still building their careers. Many of them earn salaries that fall somewhere between $80,000 and $130,000 during the WNBA season. On paper, those numbers might sound comfortable, but the reality of professional sports finances quickly complicates that perception. Taxes take a significant portion of that income. Agents receive their percentage. Players must pay for year-round training, personal coaching, travel, and housing in multiple cities. The WNBA season itself lasts only a few months, which means those earnings must stretch across the entire year. For rookies and lesser-known players who have not yet secured overseas opportunities, that WNBA paycheck is not supplemental income. It is the primary source of financial survival. This difference in economic reality has created a quiet but powerful tension inside the union. For veterans with established international contracts, the idea of pushing negotiations to the brink of a strike might seem like a reasonable risk. For players living closer to the financial edge, the same strategy feels far more dangerous. A missed season would not simply delay their income. It could threaten their ability to pay rent, support families, cover medical expenses, or maintain the professional training necessary to stay competitive in the league. As these differences became more visible, the union's internal unity began to show cracks. What once looked like a unified front gradually turned into a debate playing out across interviews, podcasts, and social media. Players began expressing opinions that did not align with the official messaging coming from union leadership. Some spoke cautiously, hinting at concerns without openly challenging the organization representing them. Others were far more direct. Among the most prominent voices calling for caution has been Kelsey Plum, a championship-winning guard whose reputation within the league carries significant weight. Plum made it clear that she believed the league had finally reached a rare and fragile moment of growth. After years of slow progress, women's basketball had suddenly captured national attention. Television ratings were climbing, arenas were filling, and media coverage had expanded dramatically. In her view, risking that momentum over a negotiation that could still be resolved at the bargaining table felt unnecessarily reckless. Another powerful voice echoing similar concerns has been Breanna Stewart, one of the most decorated players in modern women's basketball. Stewart has the stature and financial stability to remain silent if she chooses. Her championships, international contracts, and endorsements give her the freedom to avoid controversy. Yet she stepped into the conversation anyway, aligning herself with those urging caution and emphasizing the importance of protecting the league's newly gained momentum. When players of that stature begin publicly expressing doubts about union strategy, it signals a deeper institutional problem. A labor union depends on unity to function effectively. The threat of collective action, every player standing together, is what gives the organization negotiating power. But when members begin criticizing leadership in public forums, that sense of collective strength begins to erode. A union whose members openly question its strategy risks becoming something far less effective, an organization in crisis. For the players caught in the middle of this conflict, the situation feels increasingly complicated. Remaining silent might protect them from internal political backlash, but it also means watching their financial future become part of a larger strategic gamble. Speaking out, on the other hand, risks alienating union leadership and fellow players who believe a harder negotiating stance is necessary. Many of these athletes now find themselves trapped between loyalty to the union and concern for their own financial security. And hovering over this entire debate is a name that has become impossible to ignore: Caitlin Clark. Clark's arrival in the league has dramatically changed the economic landscape of the WNBA. Her games have drawn record-breaking television audiences. Her merchandise has sold at levels previously unseen in women's professional basketball. Arenas across the country have experienced attendance spikes when she appears on the schedule. For many new fans, Clark served as the entry point into the sport. They were not longtime followers of the league. They were drawn in by a single electrifying player whose college career had already captivated millions. Yet the sudden spotlight surrounding Clark has also created complicated emotions within parts of the veteran player community. For years, Many established players carried the league through difficult periods when television coverage was limited and public attention was scarce. They endured half-empty arenas and fought for recognition in a sports landscape dominated by larger leagues. To some of them, Clark's meteoric rise feels like a sudden rewriting of the narrative, a moment when a rookie receives unprecedented attention while the players who built the league struggle to share that spotlight. This emotional dynamic has occasionally surfaced in subtle ways. Physical play against Clark during games has drawn significant attention from fans and commentators. Social media discussions about fairness, recognition, and the history of the league have intensified. None of these moments alone define the league's culture, but together they reveal a deeper tension about how credit, attention, and influence should be distributed in this new era of women's basketball. Some analysts have begun suggesting that the aggressive negotiating posture adopted by certain voices within the union may be motivated by more than financial demands in their view. The dispute also reflects a struggle over control of the league's identity, its marketing direction, and the narratives that define its stars. If the balance of attention shifts dramatically toward one new player, it changes the internal hierarchy that has existed for years. Whether that interpretation is accurate or not, the consequences of a prolonged labor conflict could extend far beyond the negotiating table. The WNBA's recent media rights agreement, reportedly worth billions over more than a decade, depends on consistent content for television networks and streaming platforms. If games disappear from broadcast schedules due to a work stoppage, networks will inevitably reevaluate their investments. Reduced ratings, renegotiated contracts, or even lost partnerships could follow. The impact would also ripple outward through the broader ecosystem surrounding the league. Arena employees, team staff, and local vendors rely on game days for income. These individuals are not athletes earning endorsement deals. They are workers whose livelihoods depend on whether games are played. A canceled season would affect them immediately. Perhaps the most unpredictable variable is the fan base itself. The explosion of interest surrounding the WNBA in recent seasons has been extraordinary, but it is also relatively new. Many of the viewers who tuned in for the first time came specifically to watch Clark and the rising generation of stars transforming the league. If a labor dispute removes those games from television for an extended period, those viewers may simply move on to other sports or entertainment options. History offers a warning about how difficult it can be to recover from such moments. When Major League Baseball experienced its infamous strike in the mid-1990s, the cancellation of the World Series caused enormous damage to fan trust. Even with more than a century of history and deeply rooted traditions, the league spent years rebuilding its audience. The WNBA does not yet have that kind of cultural infrastructure. Its recent surge in popularity is real and exciting, but it is also fragile. Losing an entire season at this moment could interrupt the momentum that has taken decades to build. Inside locker rooms and negotiation rooms across the league, players understand the stakes. Many hope cooler heads will prevail and that negotiations will ultimately produce a new agreement without sacrificing the season. Owners have signaled a willingness to discuss many of the players' financial concerns, and rational voices on both sides continue to advocate for compromise. The coming months will reveal which path the league chooses. A balanced agreement could strengthen the WNBA's foundation and usher in a new era of stability and growth. But if internal divisions continue to widen, the sport could find itself risking the very momentum that finally brought it to the center of the sports world. At this moment, the future of women's basketball stands at a crossroads. The fans are watching. The networks are waiting. And the decisions made inside those negotiation rooms may determine whether this historic surge becomes a lasting transformation or a fleeting moment that slipped away. The power struggle inside the WNBA that nobody wants to talk about when the public hears about potential labor disputes in the Women's National Basketball Association. The conversation usually focuses on money. Fans assume the fight is about salaries, revenue splits, or television rights. Those issues absolutely matter, but the reality unfolding behind the scenes is far more complicated. What is developing inside the league is not simply a negotiation between players and owners. It is a power struggle over the future direction of the sport itself. At the center of this growing storm is the transformation happening in real time across the WNBA. For years, the league grew slowly, building a loyal but relatively small fan base. Attendance fluctuated. Media coverage came in waves. Television ratings occasionally spiked but rarely sustained.